This is American Television with Mitchell Hadley. I'm Dan Schneider. Mitch Hadley is a television critic and historian. We've done a lot of shows, and this is yet another one of them. Mitch, if you could give a little background about yourself.
Sure, I am a classic TV historian, mostly looking at the classic era of TV from the 50s through the early 80s, but looking at television's relationship to pop culture. I blog about it at itsabouttv.com. I'm also on X and Facebook with that. And I've authored two books about classic television, The Electronic Mirror, a collection of essays available at Amazon, Barnes& and Noble, and online. My new book is called Darkness in Prime Time, How Classic Era TV Foresaw Modern Society's Descent into Hell. Has kind of a dark title, and it's kind of a dark book, to be perfectly honest. But it is a book about the remarkable ability of classic television to have foreseen the trends, the pitfalls, the kinds of things that could and ultimately have happened in America. That's going to be available in August, so depending on when you may be watching this episode, it is either out there, will be out there, or has become a huge, incredible bestseller, which means you'll never see me again because I'll be off in the Riviera somewhere. But odds are you'll be tuning in to me again and again here. So,
And it's a good book. I've read it.
thank
So, uh, if we wanted to focus on the earlier show we did on Bill Cosby and call him what he is, a rapist, and he convicted. So this show is about a seemingly inveterate racist. And whereas I ended the last show talking about the Cosby life story being a tragedy in the old sense, I don't really get the sense of that with Roseanne Barr and her Juggernaut show. To me, Roseanne Barr, unlike Bill Cosby, seemed a wildly talentless person who just, for some reason, as the old saying goes, stepped into shit and got good luck and parlayed it and then blew it all. You know, she's like someone who walked into a Vegas casino, won $1 million, then gambled it all away. I, unlike Cosby, where I had one thing that I really thought was good, and I recognized some of the things that he did positively, but it didn't really resonate with me. Roseanne Barr is one of those people, one of those celebrities that from the very get-go, seeing her in some of the HBO stand-up things, I can't for the life of me understand what people saw in her. What is your take on her, Mitch?
Yeah, this is interesting that we're spending a couple of hours talking about two celebrities that neither of us were really big fans of, that their appeal somehow escaped us, and yet they became very successful. Now, we probably need to go on some kind of a psychoanalytical show to determine whether that says more about us than it does about popular culture. But, Roseanne Barr came to prominence with a very niche kind of comedy that was growing, I think. And it is interesting actually to take a look at the socio-economic and political consequences of this, because this blue-collar comedy that I think she falls into is really a function of a certain socioeconomic time in this country where you have a certain niche that has been carved out, whether you're talking about the status of people in the Rust Belt, or whether you're talking about people who feel that the more trendy parts of the entertainment world have simply left them behind. But whatever you want to say, Roseanne captured that core of the public. She was someone who didn't care what she thought, didn't care what she said, pointed out things that a good majority, or that a good segment of the population thought was true, and she was telling it like it was. She talked about things like teen pregnancies, domestic violence, unemployment, women's empowerment, financial struggles. These were things that a lot of people were able to identify with, both in her sitcom, well, both in her stand-up and later going into her sitcom, that struck a chord with people. And while it wasn't the kind of humor that I would gravitate toward. I never particularly thought that she was funny, but I did recognize that there was something in what she was talking about that was obviously striking a chord. And what's interesting about her, I think, is that there is in a way, I don't want to make a big point of this, but in a way there's a symbiotic relationship to Cosby in two aspects. One is that you could argue without Cosby there is no Roseanne, because the need for sitcom talent that was generated by Cosby's revitalization of the sitcom genre probably had a lot to do with someone like Roseanne getting a sitcom of her own. You need more talent, because you need to fill up these sitcom hours, and so you're looking at people who can take their act as a ready-made basis for their television show. So without Cosby, do you have the need to have a Roseanne? I'm not sure that you do. But she's also the anti-Cosby, because her family is anything but the ideal family that a Cosby show would show. It's dysfunctional. It is loud, abrasive. It's dealing with some extremely harsh issues that you don't usually see these other types of sitcoms tackle. It is much more like All in the Family than it is Cosby or Family Ties. So Cosby, in a way, made her show possible, but it also is the foil to her show. And I think that for people who didn't like the kind of Cosby humor or the kind of Cosby background that was a trademark of his shows, I think that if you're in the mood for comedy, Roseanne is maybe a perfect antidote to that. You're never going to get diabetes watching a Roseanne Barr show.
Well, I want to get back to the Cosby Roseanne connection, because they had people behind the scenes who are working on both shows and developing them. We'll get to that in a moment. I want to just talk. To me, Roseanne, even before her show, when I'd see her do her stand up on late night or whatnot, I never liked it because of a very simple reason. When you took someone like a George Carlin, he was always punching up towards people in power. It always seems to me Roseanne Barr was punching downward at the people she came from. There wasn't a great degree of empathy. It's like when you see some black comedians talking about the ghetto and talking about hoes and bitches and this kind of thing. And I got the sense that if there had been no such thing as what we'd call, I guess, white trash, there'd have been no Roseanne. She couldn't do any other kind of humor. Whereas Cosby, I think, had the potential to be much more than he was. She just lucked out in having this very small purview. What was your take on that?
I think you're right. I think that I mentioned the blue collar aspect. I think the white trash is another. That is probably you're getting into the Venn diagram type of thing, that you have an overlap between the white trash segment and the blue collar segment. I don't think that they are necessarily the same segment, but I think that there was a lot of appeal to that. But you're right. It's not the story of Cosby rising from adversity and making his way through the ghetto to come up and be an example of, see what I can accomplish, where he has become successful not because of his background, but in spite of his background. Roseanne has a much harsher, meaner, nastier tone, perhaps, in that. I think that I always had the impression of hers being angry, and I think that she was either angry at at the system for keeping her down, angry at the patriarchy for not playing fair with women, angry at the socioeconomic standards that are going around, and the anger fueled her comedy in a way that is different with someone like Carlin, who is much more ironic, or Pryor, who really didn't have any kind of sacred cows at all that he was dealing with. I think that whether you frame it that she was punching down, or however you want to tackling the sacred cows, however you want to look at it, there was always a sense, I thought, that there was an anger fueling what she was talking about, and that part of her appeal was the appeal of angry people listening to an angry comic talking about that. Now, that may only be my perception. As I say, I was never a big fan of hers, so I wasn't inclined to really sit down and analyze her comedy. But it was what always struck me about her. And so when she gets her own series and that kind of thing carries through, because it really is just, she's playing herself in the series, just like many successful comedians of that era did. Then I think that there is a sort of harshness, reactivity about it.
So I mentioned two shows when we talked about Cosby and them as sort of precursors, the Brady Bunch and Family Ties. There were two shows that came before Roseanne that I want to mention that I think did much better than Roseanne, which was labeled at the time and even now a slob comedy. The first one that's always mentioned, which I don't really see why you'd call it a slob comedy other than it was working class, was again All in the Family. That was a much better written show. It was a much more literate show. With the exception of Roseanne, the only actor that seemed to really shine was John Goodman. Yes, Laurie Metcalf got the role in JFK, the film. But I don't think you can even remotely compare the two shows in terms of their overall quality. There are things you can watch on All in the Family, things that happened in the 80s, 90s, that keeps, even though it's specific to the 70s, the show itself, that keeps it culturally relevant in a way Roseanne doesn't. And the other show, which I think is far superior, was Married with Children, which came on a year before. And the reason I mentioned this was it's a slob comedy, and my wife actually loves Married with Children. It's one of the few surprises that I've had with her in all my years with her. But she pointed out what I've always thought was that Married with Children was a satire. It knew it was looking at itself and laughing at itself and didn't have pretense. With Roseanne to me was sort of like a slob comedy, Family Ties. It had this wishy-washy thing where it wanted to be an all-American thing, whereas Married with Children said, fuck it, we're not. We're on Fox. We're going to go balls to the walls just for the laughter. And so to me, Roseanne, the show, always had a pretension to it that it was something more than what it really was. And that undercut it. And that's why when you look at, I'm not talking about the current or the recently passed Connors version of the show, but if you look at the 80s, 90s Roseanne, it doesn't hold up nearly as well as All in the Family, much less Married with Children.
Well, and I think you could throw The Simpsons in there as well,
because the early ones.
Yep. And I think you're spot on with something I hadn't really thought about in that context. And of course, Married with Children is a very good comparison. But that whole satire aspect to it, when we talked about the Brady Bunch, I had used the word kitsch in a complimentary and an affectionate way. Of course, there's nothing affectionate about Married with Children in that sense because it's edgier, but it's the same kind of thing that both Married with Children and The Simpsons knew that they were satirizing a certain genre, a certain aspect of things, and it made their humor much smarter. It was wittier in addition, and I think even, if you want to go back to All in the Family, one of the things that people overlook about All in the Family that you really have to go back and look at was when in the early days, the early year or two of All in the Family, if you read the contemporary articles, you find that there was this stunned reaction from a lot of people to the idea that the audience was not perceiving the show necessarily in the way that Norman Lear had intended, and that in fact a lot of people were agreeing with what Archie was saying, rather than seeing him as a character that was a satire of the blue collar hard hat mentality. They were turning him into a cultural icon, and that is for another day and another discussion. But
Yeah.
the reason I bring that up is to point to the very intelligence and literacy of the show, that people could take it in different ways. Archie was not simply a cartoonish character, or you wouldn't have had so many people from different sides of the political aisle identifying with him for various reasons. He wouldn't have become a hero to the right, even to the extent that he was a satire to people on the left, unless the show was well written, the characters were well defined, and they were given a certain depth rather than a two-dimensional cartoonish aspect to it. It says a lot about the show, and I think it does say something about Lear in that he didn't want to present it as a totally preachy, one-dimensional thing. Lear always liked people to make up their own minds about things. He was so big on free speech in that sense. And I think that when you talk about Roseanne Barr shows, you talk about her as being you can talk about her as being a trailblazer. The feminist aspects, the irreverent aspects, how raw she was. But is that going to hold up? And I think I think it's very much a show of its time, and I think that you make a very good argument that it is not going to hold up as well as some of these other shows did, that it isn't going to be timeless, that the quality, and we'll use that word loosely, that what quality it does have is not necessarily going to have the staying power that these others did. It was a time. It was a moment. And when they reboot Roseanne, when she comes back, it's partly as a nostalgic figure that they're trying to go back and capture lightning twice. It's no longer the cutting edge sitcom, if it ever was. It's no longer that. It's now an attempt to try to rebottle it. It isn't. They're not even trying to repackage it. They're not even trying to say Roseanne for the 2000s. They're just saying, you loved her once, love her again.
Yeah, it's like trying to do Sam and Diane with Sam chugging Viagra. So I mentioned the connection between Cosby and Roseanne. Can you go into a little bit more on that?
Well, you're right. They shared a lot of the behind the scenes type of things, the production crew, various people that were involved in it, and I think that you can see the yin and yang involved in that. I think that both Cosby and Roseanne are in a sense marginalized figures. And now, this is really getting into the meta aspects of it all. You've got Cosby, who represents the black actor, the black businessman, the black tycoon, somebody who has never really had a lot of power or influence in the industry. Likewise, you have Roseanne, the loud, outspoken feminist model. Pushy. You remember in the Cosby discussion, we had talked about various traits that women, for example, are given. That when a man is outspoken, it's seen as a good thing. When a woman is outspoken, she's shrewish. I think that was something I said, and it's similar here. That Roseanne is not. She's not outspoken. She's brash. She's brassy, and so in one way, they're trying to capture that very same vibe that Cosby is, just from a different angle, a different standpoint. But again, I think the adverse side to it, and I think this is very shrewd if it was intentional, if it wasn't simply Roseanne's personality taking everything over, the idea of that you're coupling them in a sense that as a production philosophy, what you've got are two shows that may be diametrically opposed in terms of the appeal that they would have, but in doing so, what you're really doing is you're offering something for the entire audience. If you like Roseanne, maybe you don't like Cosby. If you like Cosby, maybe you don't like Roseanne. Again, there's the Venn diagram aspect to it, that people are going to look at Roseanne and say, well, no matter how dysfunctional this family is, they still come together, they still love each other, they're like the honeymooners. That's a stretch, I think, but you could make that argument. That in the end they all stick together as a family, and so there is an overlap with the Cosby idea that these are families, that they are families that have their quirks, that have their certain nuances to them, but they keep going, and so there is a complementary nature to that as well. And I think if I'm out there pitching sitcoms, I'm looking at being able to put out both a Roseanne and a Cosby, and I'm saying that between these two, we've covered a huge part of the market, and that we can build more shows off of either one of them. We can, you like the Roseanne Barr show? Let's try Grace Under Pressure. Let's try other shows that are similar to that. Let's try see what Tim Allen has. They're all different aspects, but I think that you can say these shows are all have the same playbook in a way, and it's the same thing with Cosby. You've got shows that spin off from that as well, and so I wonder if that isn't simply a diversification of your portfolio that shows that you're able to hit a broad audience with your different offerings.
It's interesting you brought up Grace Under Pressure, because I once tried to interview Brett Butler, and I got an email back from Brett Butler herself, and she thanked me, said, "Thank you, Dan. It's flattering that you would ask me to do that," but she said that the reality is I'm not that good of an actress. I was not a good actress, and she was very blunt that her show was very much a one-dimensional show. And I still got the email somewhere in my list of hundreds of emails or thousands of emails that I've sent out. And the thing is, yeah, it was in a sense, a slightly lighter version of Roseanne. But I don't know if the real Roseanne realized how limited a range she had. Brett Butler seems to have been cognizant of that.
I will admit that there was always something about Brett Butler that touched me in a way. There was something you could identify within her struggles, and that I never had with Roseanne. I wouldn't say that I was a big fan of either show, but there was something about her story personally that kind of touched me on that, and I find that an interesting anecdote that I would agree that I don't know if Roseanne had that level of self-awareness about her to realize that what she really had was a one-trick pony, and that almost everything she did, including, and I don't know if we'll get to this in depth or not, and so I did want to just mention it very briefly. When you look at the controversies that have surrounded Roseanne, there are two that in particular that both seem to come from the same point. One is that famous fiasco when she performed the national anthem and was grabbing her crotch and became the bane of cultural conservatives everywhere. And it was almost as if she was saying I was just making fun of it. I was just being funny. Well, in another way, you're blaming your audience for not understanding the joke, and you're also identifying you only have one joke.
Mm.
And that's it. And if your audience doesn't like the joke about the red giraffe, better be able to come up with a blue zebra. And I don't think she's got a blue zebra. She's just got a red giraffe. But then the flip side of that is the later controversy, the one that really brought her down, at the same time made her something of a cult icon within the very group that was the most turned off by her in the original dispute. Now those people who vilified her are standing up for her and saying she's a victim of cancel culture, and she's gone on to a certain level of success within that group. And so it's an interesting dichotomy, but it all stems from this same one joke thing. This is who I am. This is what I am.
Yeah.
This is all I am.
Which gets into the elephant in the room about Roseanne that's come out, is that she has, I think, a well-documented thing with, I don't know what mental ills, but whether it's schizophrenia or whatever it might be, saying inappropriate things at the wrong time, the crotch grabbing thing, the racist stuff that she spewed. I think that's one of the things with the show that if they were going to be just sort of a darker version of Family Ties and do these very special episodes, which they did quite a bit of them as far as I recall, I think it would have been better for the show had she made the character, and I hate saying this because 9 times out of 10 I say you don't bring in your own personal ills to a character. Although on soap operas they do that a lot of times. On sometimes in television shows they do, but something to get her away from being that one-trick pony, excuse me. And I think that could have given the show a little bit of a gravitas if the main character had been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder or whatever it has been. You could still have the comedy, you could still do the stuff, but there you could also layer in some of this is why Roseanne has acted this way, because like I said, even in her stand-up comedy, and certainly in the show, it always seemed to be punching down. There was a nastiness to the humor. Yes, there was nastiness in Married with Children, but it was cartoon nastiness. It's the difference between Donald Duck being able to get away with a joke that a real person couldn't.
It's the anvil falling on the head, and it just turns you into an accordion. That's a very interesting thought that you could incorporate something like that as not as a source of humor per se, but as kind of an explanatory aspect of somebody's character that really would have given the character a bit more dimension and maybe even a bit more understanding or sympathy, because otherwise you really come across as either somebody who goes off the rails constantly, or somebody who has no filter whatsoever, and it doesn't. In the end, it doesn't make you much more than one-dimensional.
I know that we talked before on several different shows here and there about the original I Love Lucy, and I think both of us are of the nature of it's an important show, but it is not top tier in terms of the actual show, if I'm correct in your assessment as well.
Yes.
And I think one of the things that was always missing from the Roseanne show is she has her sister, and her sister is the nicer, calmer, I guess smarter version of the one played by Laurie Metcalf. But the thing that was missing, I think, is they needed to have a little bit more Lucy and Ethel kind of thing. Rather than having the show always be inward about the family's finances or the family's this or that, you could have had shows where Roseanne and her sister got a job, and to use all those, they're on the candy line,
Yep.
or they're stomping the grapes. Some of this outrageous stuff. Now people would say, well, that was the 1950s. This is the 80s. You have to be more realistic. It's a comedy show.
That's
People
right.
don't crack jokes normally. We're already beyond reality when we're doing a show that's just a comedy. Comedy is not drama. Drama tries to be an imitation of life, to borrow the old Van Gogh film thing. But comedy says, no, we're already beyond that. And I think that would have humanized the Roseanne character a bit more, to see her stomping and falling on grapes, or constantly eating the Reese's peanut butter cups or whatever as they come down the line.
Well, someone who understood that kind of concept very well was Jack Benny. And Jack knew that all of his personal foibles, the ones that were part of his comic persona, his stinginess, his vanity, his ego, all of that was comic gold, because the humor from so many of the Jack Benny programs came from people making fun of him, and scoring points at his expense. And one of the reasons that Rochester, for example, is such an iconic character, one of the reasons that he's in the Radio Hall of Fame along with Jack, is because he wasn't a foil for Jack as much as Jack was a foil for him, man. And I think that you're right that Roseanne could have benefited from some of those kinds of elements, and in turn, what those things would have done, combined with the Benny kind of a philosophy of making her on occasions the butt of the joke, rather than the person punching down, the person getting punched every once in a while. It humanizes you, and beyond that, it also is great comedy. Jack Parr, particularly when he was hosting The Tonight Show, Parr never cared if somebody got a joke off at his expense if it was funny.
Yeah.
And he knew that oftentimes his reaction to a joke could sell the joke, and so he'd tell them to have a camera ready to catch his reaction. But the point was that if you were funny, even at his expense, what counted was that. And Benny was very generous in his humor. He always would say the same thing to his writers: if it's a funny line, I don't care who gets it. And I never got that feeling that you had that sense. Even, Archie Bunker, we keep coming back to All in the Family, and one of the points about Archie was that some of the funniest parts of those shows was when the joke was turned on him.
Yeah.
And he became the butt of the joke, but at the same time, he never lost the audience's sympathy, and he never became a cartoonish figure himself. And if more comedians, and I think you could make this argument about Roseanne, maybe not everybody would agree with us, but I think you could make the argument that that show could have profited by that whole kind of thing that you're talking about and that I'm talking about, in terms of buying a little leeway for the characters, so that when the individual, in her case, if she does something more outrageous in her personal life, you're apt to have a little more slack.
Yeah, as you were speaking, an old show came back to me that I think exemplifies what is missing from Roseanne. I remember in the early mid-70s watching late night during the summer, the old Burns and Allen show. And if you watch that show, it did two things that modern comedies don't do, with maybe the exception of the early Seinfeld. And that is, you had them coming out before and at the end of the show doing a 1 or 2 minute little number which said, "This is an artifice." Then within that rest of the half hour, you had husband and wife comedy. But what made Burns and Allen so good is it wasn't just constantly one way. George Burns, would say something. He seemed to be the smart one, whereas Gracie would be the loopy one, and she'd talk about this, and she'd go this way and that way and that way, and then it would go back to George, and and he wouldn't understand a thing she would say. She'd say something, and it would all crystallize, even to the viewer. And then we see that George is not. George isn't just the smart one all the time. Sometimes her loopiness is smarter than him, and that really plays into the dynamics of the way two people who are married work together.
Mm-hmm.
And I never got that sense with Roseanne and John Goodman's character. Yes, there were, I'm sure, touching scenes within, and I might have watched 15, 20 episodes of the original show at the most. But I never got that sense that I think, had they been able to say, this is a comedy, let's take it out to its logical extent, and let's look at family dynamics and have more of those Burns and Allen type moments, not only between the married couple, but between the sisters, between the kids and the parents.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that they ever did that. And I think that's why the show, artistically for me, fails.
Well, I think we're starting to get into the whole idea of rewriting the sitcom, the genre, or particularly this one, in talking about it. But I think that there are things that you can look at and you can say, this might have been a better idea. And this might have been something interesting to try. What it points out to me, I think, is the downside of taking a stand-up comedian and basing an entire sitcom on their routine, because their routine is by definition fairly narrowly focused. And so when you're talking about Roseanne's routine, or again, with so many sitcoms, you're talking about something that is confined to the persona you present to the audience when you're going through your routine. In order to translate successfully to the screen for any length of time, I think it helps if you're able to broaden that. If you are, in a sense, the same comparison you make when you take a successful stage play or musical and bring it to the movies, you've got to be able to go outside of the stage. You've got to be able to break through that setting and introduce other elements, going outside, introducing different things that make it less stage bound. And it's in a similar way. I think that there's an art in the sitcom to being able to make your plot less routine bound, that you have to broaden your perspective and the depth of your character. And I think you're correct that I don't know that the show ever was able to do that, or even to the extent that they tried to do it. Now, as successful as it was, you can argue, why mess with success? But and people can say, well, it was never your kind of show anyway. It isn't going to be any better. But these are our observations, and that's part of what you're getting out of this is our opinion on something. And I think that would have made it a better show. And I think ultimately what you do have to do in the context of our conversation is take these different points you're looking at and throw it back onto the people we're looking at, whether it was Cosby before or Roseanne now, and say, what does this say about the person who's in charge of the show, who is clashing with the producers, clashing with the writers, clashing with co-stars? What is this saying about that person and their willingness to go beyond what their character has been, and to become more creative, to take more risks, to perhaps open the character up, to open themselves up in a way that makes them more vulnerable to the audience?
So they revive Roseanne a quarter century later. Did Roseanne even last a full season on that revival? And what exactly was the thing that she did that got her canceled? And then they took a name off the show. So she's not getting any royalties for whatever if that show goes into syndication. What exactly? I mean, you don't have to use the words or anything, but what was
Sure.
it?
Well, what I'll do is borrow an expression from one of the articles about it. She made a reference to Valerie Jarrett, who was part of the Obama administration.
Okay.
She was an aide, and she made a broad comparison between Valerie Jarrett and an ape.
Mm.
And what happened happened was two things, I think. Number one, you had a segment of the population that was broadly in agreement with that, but you had, I mean, with the sentiment, maybe not. Again, what you're saying is that Roseanne had courted controversy for her entire professional career, and she came across as not having a filter. But there is a difference between being unfiltered and being crude or boorish or offensive, and she never had built up the goodwill and the versatility within her career to be able to plausibly look at something and say that it was poorly expressed, and that not blaming people for taking it the wrong way, but saying my limitations prevented me from articulating it in such a way that the listener would be able to take the joke in the way in which I had intended. It's a long way of saying that, but the show had, to that point, you're right. It was still during its first season, because this incident happened in May. And so you're not talking about the show being a mid-season replacement and then making it onto the fall schedule, because you're still in that initial reboot phase. And it had been quite successful. It had gotten about 18 million viewers, which was not as high as the original, but it was very good for the TV ratings map as it consists of today. Well, in short order, the revival's canceled. She's taken out of it. She's claiming that it was due to her use of Ambien, which there may be something to that. But again, I want to say that she hadn't really built things up to the point where people were willing to take that kind of an excuse. It falls into the category of irreparable damage. And when the show comes back, it doesn't have her name on it. She doesn't have anything to do with it. And it manages to go along for a few more years. Really is a completely different concept, because once you remove her from the show, you are taking it into a different realm of sitcom.
Yeah. Now, I think again the whole thing with the comments about this black lady, it goes to the thing again of punching down, or if you're black, you can more plausibly use the N-word than if you're not. I'm not saying it's 100%, but if you're doing comedy, especially if you're talking about the mafia or gangsters and you're Italian, you've got more credibility than if you're Swedish. And I think that's the thing that neither Roseanne Barr herself, much less the whole political current of the MAGA movement, really understands is that yes, you have freedom of speech, but that doesn't mean just because you have a right that it's right to do certain things or say certain things.
You have accountability and responsibility for what you do.
And this, I think, goes back to her and the mental ills and whatever, the lack of self-awareness. Whereas we can talk about Cosby and his sexual deviance in terms of being some kind of cultural pathology. People could say, well, he was he's a black man, and he was in Hollywood, and he had all the opportunity to have sex with white women that black men dream of historically, blah, blah. And you can couch it in fancy terms like that. Here we're just talking about someone who has no filter, no maturity, no self-understanding. So yes, Cosby committed crimes. No one's saying that Roseanne should be jailed for her comments. There's a difference between being a rapist and a racist. Now, if she were advocating lynching black men from the trees, that's a different
You're
order.
elevating the,
but still, it seems to me, even though these people both fell, they fell for far different reasons. What is your take on both of their falls in comparison?
There is one similarity, I think, which is hubris.
Yeah.
And I think that when you reach a certain level of stardom, you kind of assume or you feel like you're immune. And Cosby may have felt he was immune, that he could do anything he wanted because he was who he was. He was too powerful to fail. Roseanne may have suffered from a different kind of hubris, which was that I've gotten away with outrageous behavior in the past. There's no reason I can't do it now. In a way, all of this makes her excuses more plausible because it was such an outrageous thing to say that in retrospect, the first thing you want to say to her is, what were you thinking? What were you thinking when you did this? And the only logical, reasonable answer that comes back is, I wasn't thinking at all. Because if you're thinking even a little bit, you're realizing that you have crossed over a line from satire to cruelty, and that when that happens, again, the whole punching down thing that you're talking about, versus the idea of satirizing something, which will have a very hard edge, but it usually is cast in a different way. I think that it does make one of Roseanne's excuses a little more plausible in that it isn't the kind of thing that a person who even thinks about something would think about doing. But it seems also to be in a certain character with her in that, the crotch grabbing during the national anthem. Who would think that was funny? Saying something like this. Who would think that was funny? And I think that I think that it does suggest that she did not have a self-awareness of what this could do to her career. And where it differs, though, from Cosby, I think you're right in two fundamental areas. You could say that Cosby was a certain personification of evil. Now, there are many different kinds of evil. He's a certain personification of it. Roseanne, I don't see what she did as being evil as much as being profoundly stupid. Yeah. And yes, you have what Hannah Arendt talked about as the banality of evil. And if you want to try to make a case for that in this case, I won't dispute you, but I think what she did was really stupid more than anything else. The other aspect, though, which I think is very interesting to look at, is that unlike Cosby, who has become, as we said, a nothing, he's disappeared from the scene. This has completely destroyed his career with no possibility of recovery. This hasn't destroyed Roseanne's career. What it has done is turn her from a mainstream star in a particular facet to much more of a niche figure within a particular aspect. She still has a following. She has now become more of a cult hero on the right than she was on the left. She can go on a show like Gutfield and talk about things and get a positive response. She can have a social media presence and talk about conservative issues and and count on having a sympathetic audience. And that's something that Cosby doesn't and won't ever have. So there's a fundamental difference in what the impact has been on their careers. Is her career what it was? No. Will her career ever be what it once was? Never say never, but I really doubt it. But is her career done, over? Is her goose cooked? No, I don't think so. And so that does tell you that the nature of her crime, to the extent that you want to call it that, was not quite to the level of what Cosby did. And that it's conceivable she could rebound to outside of the niche that she's in right now to a broader audience, even if it isn't the audience that she once had. You look at somebody like Charlie Sheen. He's been able to come back to a certain extent. People might say it's just Charlie being Charlie. Yeah. If what Roseanne had done was not so racially loaded, And if it had not come along at a time in history when it had, I think, and if she had a certain different persona about her, you people could have said it's just Roseanne being Roseanne, and she would have had more of of more wiggle room to get out of something like that. But it's very interesting. It's if you want to make a broad comparison, I talked about Godfrey, Arthur Godfrey, with Cosby, but I'll use it again in an instance with Roseanne. What Roseanne did was more like Godfrey in that it wasn't illegal. It was somewhat immoral, but you can't really talk about that to any degree of certainty. What it did was stupid, what it did alienated people, and what it did was ensure that her career would never be what it was before. What Cosby did is more like O.J. Simpson. He broke the law, he violated people, he made he did something that was evil, as I say, and so their crimes, their downfalls can have parallels in other with other people, but they are really different from they are different in so many more ways than they are the same.
So to wrap it up, I talked about Cosby and his scenario being more like a classical tragedy. Let me give a comparison for Roseanne and see what you think of it. Uh, so I think she has fallen from grace, but I think she's not the pariah so much as she's now just a freak show.
Hmm.
I think of a number of actors and stuff who did assorted different things. I think of Pee Wee Herman jerking off in a
Yep.
theater. I think of that fellow Carrot Top who got all steroidal, and instead of being known for a comedian, he's got this horrid face and ridiculous body, and he just looks like a freak. Um, and I'm sure that there are others that could come to mind. It reminds me of the end, literally, of the old film, if you've seen it, Freaks, Todd Browning's Freaks from
Yes.
1932, where the nasty blonde gorgeous girl at the circus or the freak the carnival, wherever they're at, gets attacked by all the freaks because she wanted to hurt the little midget guy, and then she ends up as this hybrid chicken freak at the end going grah, 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 grah. And to me, that's what Roseanne is. She's the freak at the end of Freaks, the real freak.
Yeah.
And you can pity her to an extent you can't really pity Cosby, but it's not a tragedy in the sense because
No.
she lucked out and she was too stupid to realize that it was luck, not her own
Hmm.
talent, that got her there.
Yeah,
What's your take on that?
you're right. It's not a tragedy. It's kind of it's more like a
Yeah,
comedy of errors,
yeah,
or theater of the absurd.
yeah,
What she has done, I think, is marginalize herself.
yeah.
And I used the term niche, and you've used the term freak show, and I think both of those have a lot of validity. Whichever way you want to look at it, though, what she has done is more or less guarantee that her future career will not be dead, but it will be marginalized. And if you're used to being a big star, I think it's that is quite a come down to be marginalized. So, yep, you're right. Tragedy, comedy. It's why they're the part of the same bill in the theater.
Well, I guess on that note, we'll let this go, and we'll be back next month to talk about some other aspect of American television. Mitch, thanks a lot.
Always a pleasure, Dan.